Welcome, Internet. Today we're going to be talking about how to become a clinical psychologist here in France. Well, the first thing you have to understand with being a psychologist here in France is that it's a protected title, i.e. not everyone can claim to be a psychologist. If someone that doesn't have the title claims to be a psychologist, they can be prosecuted and fined quite severely. So it isn't something that you can just basically claim. You have to go through the studies. So how it breaks down here in France is that it's 5 years of study minimum. So in France, to be a clinical psychologist, you need a master's degree. There are, of course, doctors of psychology, but it's more, the doctorate here is more considered there for research purposes or to basically be a professor at a university, but it doesn't impact the title or the missions that you get. For example, I only have a master's degree, right? But technically speaking, I have this. If I was employed tomorrow by a hospital or an institution, I would basically get the same compensation financially, and I also get the same tasks as someone who's at doctorate level. So the doctorate here in France is really for research purposes, and that's how it's thought of. There are at present discussions with professional organizations trying to push the clinical diploma to a doctorate level, i.e. that psychologists would have to basically, to become psychologists or psychologists in training, would have to go for at least 8 years and do a thesis. It isn't the case right now, and I very much doubt that it's going to be in the near foreseeable future, in the near future, because the government is quite opposed to it, because what they want is people that are relatively quickly trained, and also there are other elements I'm not going to go into which basically hinder progress on that discussion. But the idea is basically that to become a psychologist you need 5 years. 5 years, and what happens during those years? We have the first 3 years, which basically are a degree, and we call it here in France a licence. So a licence is not a license to practice. It's really the first 3 years, and in those first 3 years you train in a bit of everything. You become a jack of all trades, right? Like, for example, you get a bit of psychoanalysis, a bit of cognitive, a bit of statistics, a bit of neurology, and you kind of get a broader perspective on the field rather than something too specific. And then, once you are at master's level, then you get to choose your speciality, i.e., for example, if you're interested in neuropsychology, you're going to go there. If you're interested in cognitive, you're going to go there. If you're interested in psychoanalysis, there are also masters for that. So it's a very wide range of things that are studied during the first 3 years. And masters is there for the speciality. So basically that speciality is something that's learned in the 2 last years. And it often comes with internships. So internships have this interesting quality here in France that the first 3 years they're not mandatory, but it's kind of expected of the student, even if they do neuropsychology or something else, to at least just try and get an internship in a mental health institution. With adults, children, that varies. In my university, it was mandatory for us to get an internship in psychiatry, because the idea of the university is that it's mandatory for psychologists to know about psychiatry before going into any other field. And it's a perspective that I fully respect, as basically once once you've worked in psychiatry, you kind of have a lot more tools, and you are confronted from the get-go at perhaps the more intense and extreme side of what the work as a psychologist can be. I.e., you've seen the far reaches of it, and then you can encompass everything. Of course, during those internships, you're not left alone. The university provides supervision. So supervision is not individual. It's not like one-to-one. It's like a small group of maybe 15, 20 people with the teacher. So how it happens is basically at university, the supervision is, it's interesting, but you don't get it too frequently. Like you might get once every like semester, twice, maybe 3 times a year if you're like really, really asking for advice. But most of the time you like listen to others, and the professor gives their take on the situation. And supervision in university really depends on the teacher that you have. Like if someone is just there to like get his paycheck, they might not be that invested, and someone that's like uh, really there for the passion of transmitting what they know, it can be great. It can be appalling or great depending on who you get. But so you're not left alone. Also, you are always asked to train under senior psychologist. So, for example, in my case, in my university, it was asked that the senior psychologists have at minimum 3 years of field work, not like a young psychologist, but already someone that had a bit of experience. And at the best, like what was really recommended was to have a psychologist that had at least 5 years practice under his belt before you even start. Like they did not really want, how can I say, fresh out of the gate psychologists training young psychologists, or young trainees. What they wanted was a seasoned psychologist to really like train, and that's, I think, fair enough. Like I mean, even though it's always been very hard to get internships, because here in France there are a lot of rules on basically on financial compensation and what can be done, what can't be done. Some mental health institutions don't want to pay interns. There's a lot of stuff going on. But anyway, once you've got the internship, you are asked to do at minimum 500 hours over the course of 3 years. So each year, like they give you a certain amount. Like the first year might not be that much. It might be a starters. So basically, it might be like you get maybe 100, 180 hours. Then you move up, and then at the end, the aim is for the person to have minimum 500 hours. And I say minimum because I got 1,000 hours on the whole of my education, right? And basically, once you get that point, because you have to be validated, so there's a double validation that occurs. You have to be academically good enough, i.e., you have to you have to succeed in your exams, but you also have to get the approval of the senior psychologist of your institution, i.e., if they say that basically you're not fit, you might get basically you might fail your year or have to start another year. So that's in theory. In practice, I've seen a lot of people getting very bad reports, but still passing through because of a technicality. So how can I say this? The details might vary, but the general idea is that you get a dual evaluation. So fundamentally, after that, what happens is that during your masters, you'll be asked to do 2 theses. A first one in basically 4th year, and a second one in 5th year. So the one in 4th year can be theoretical, but it can be clinical. But the one in 5th year, if you're going to specialize in basically clinical psychology, i.e., becoming a psychologist and a therapist, you're going to do a clinical thesis. And that clinical thesis is about a patient that you follow, that you've not necessarily provided psychotherapy for, but at least that you've had experience with. Because not all institutions provide psychotherapy. Some of them only provide evaluations, some of them only provide counseling. It very much depends on the institution you are in at the time and what you can or can't do. Some internships allow you to do a lot of stuff, like, for example, sessions, like providing psychotherapy, but not all. And some of them, even in the worst case scenario, don't teach you anything. Like they say, "Oh, you're the intern. We don't trust you with patients. Just don't don't interact with them. Go and see another profession." Right. So it really depends on where you're going in, basically. So after that, so when you present your thesis, you're going to be evaluated by basically two people, the jury and the co-jury. So the one that has the final say is the jury, i.e. the teacher which you basically trained for the year. And depending on their regard and how they see your work, the work that you've provided through your thesis and through what you've told them, what you've thought, they might validate or invalidate your marks. For example, back in my day, and I know it's changed, but back in my day, for example, there was a minimum, like you had to have at least 14 out of 20 to basically go into last year. To get that professional master's, you had to at the very least, have 14 in your thesis. And if you did not, the problem is that you were blocked. You could not go to the second years of masters, but you could not go back to do it. So they've changed it now that basically the cutoff point is at the end of the first 3 years. Like you succeed the third year, and the third year is when you have to qualify for masters, which, to be honest, is much better because at least you have at least a degree, right? And then even if you're cut off and it's a very painful experience, even if you cut off, you still don't waste time. Whereas if you do an extra year, that extra year is not going to bring you anything, as you can't qualify as a psychologist, and then you have to redo a lot of training to be a psychotherapist. And basically after that, after you got the internship validated and the thesis validated, you are granted the title of psychologist. So what happens after that? Well, basically, at that point, you're free to practice in France. What you will have to do is go to l'ARS, l'Agence Régionale de Santé, to get your RPPS number, i.e. the healthcare number of the professional. At the ARS, they will basically check your diplomas. If they have any doubts, they'll phone up your university or get in contact with the university to see if you've basically earned your diploma or if they're fake. And I'm saying that because some people have faked their diplomas, not too great, and they got into a lot of trouble for that, but you get the idea. Fundamentally, this agency, the regional health agency, basically gives you a number, and from that number you can work in an institution, you can work in a private practice. In France, there is no necessarily requirements for continued training, i.e. you're not going to lose your title for it. It's expected that you will do it, right? But there won't be any consequences if you don't. So unfortunately, some people stop training completely and stay on the basis of what they know. But that's not the majority of people, and I have met a few. Often, but I mean, you can't there's nothing to prevent them from doing that, but it's not very ethical. And our code of deontology stipulates that we have to continue learning throughout our professional careers and life in order to better help our patients. And that's something I completely and fully commit to on a personal and on a professional level. So basically, once you have your number, you can do whatever you want. You can work in an institution, you can work in a private practice. You don't need a license, for example, in the US. The registry to the healthcare organization is like licensing. You just have to say to that organization what you're doing precisely, right? For example, if you go in an institution, you have to write them an email telling them that you're in this and that or in this institution. So fundamentally, after this point, the psychologist is going to be able to do what they want in their specialty, because once you've graduated as a clinical psychologist, you can work within institutions that ask for clinical psychologists and in private practice. If you graduate as a neuropsychologist, you can work in institutions that ask for neuropsychology. For example, a lot of hospitals where there's patients with strokes, with aphasia, with dementia might ask for a neuropsychologist rather than a clinical one. And inversely, for example, a hospital that deals with schizophrenics, bipolar might ask for a clinician rather than a neuropsychologist. However, the tricky thing is that in France, technically speaking, there is one diploma for us all, meaning that even though we have subspecialties, technically speaking, what makes us all come together is that we're all psychologists, regardless of speciality. And in our case, it's relatively easy to jump from one sector to another. You just have to redo a training course and a master's in the specialty. For example, neuropsychologists can become a clinical psychologist by basically doing the 2 years, or perhaps just 1 year. The idea is that it's not hard to go from one to the other. And I was talking about neuropsychologists a lot and clinical psychologists, but there are many others: cognitive psychologists, behavioral psychologists, social psychologists, a plethora of psychologists, right? Work psychologists. I mean, there's plenty of us here. And also, once all of that is done, basically the world becomes your oyster. So what happens next in the career? Well, basically, there's two big types of work you're going to be able to do as a clinical psychologist: working in an institution, working in a private practice. Both jobs are very different. They have very different missions. Both have their pros and cons. And fundamentally, when I was studying, it always told us that you have to start by the institution. But nowadays, a lot of young people are starting with private practice, which is not bad in of itself, as long as they have supervision and they basically have a way of talking about what is happening with the patient. That's the only criteria that I would say is important. But yet again, you're not forced to do supervision. Once university stops, you're not forced to. But a vast majority of psychologists, myself included, seek supervision, just to be sure, just to be completely fine with the fact that we are in the right direction. So basically, that's pretty much it. That's how you become a clinical psychologist in France. I should also add that basically, psychologist is part of the free mental health professions that are protected by the state, i.e., that not anyone can just take up the mantle of psychologist. I'm saying that because right now in France we're having kind of a semi-crisis of psycho-practitioners in psychotherapy, i.e. people that are not necessarily trained or trained very poorly, like 2 weeks in a year, and then claim that they can do psychotherapy. And we're kind of at a point where there's been more and more of them. But those titles are not protected, i.e. anyone can call themselves a psycho-practitioner. Not everyone can call themselves a psychologist. And the three professions that are protected are psychologists, psychiatrists, and psychotherapists. The rest is basically is someone that can take on those mantles without any qualifications asked. So fundamentally, I think it's important for someone that's intellectually honest to at least be part of one of those three professions. Even though it takes time, takes effort, and it takes a lot of dedication, it's still very important, as it's at least a basic form of guarantee. Doesn't mean you're going to be good, but at least you've passed your exams. If you didn't cheat, obviously. I'm joking, I'm being facetious, but you get the idea. It's a minimum, and one that is exactly what I think, a bare minimum that needs to be expanded upon throughout one's career, and I would even go so far as to say one's life. So anyway, that pretty much sums it up. So this is how you become a clinical psychologist in France. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one.